So, hi everyone, thanks for coming. I'm delighted to introduce Roopika Risam, who has been here before, but I missed it, so for me it's my first time getting to introduce her. She's Assistant Professor of English and the Faculty Fellow for Digital Library Initiatives at Salem State. And her interests lie at the intersection of post-colonial African diaspora studies, humanities knowledge infrastructures, digital humanities, and new media. So let me explain a little bit about what that means. I'm going to cite just a line from her first book, New Digital Worlds, which came out in Northwestern last year. It's an approach to uncovering and intervening in the disruptions within the digital cultural record, as she describes it, especially as those have been produced and continue to be produced intentionally and unintentionally by colonialism and neo-colonialism. So for those of you who are thinking about DH and how this work positions itself in the framework of a larger DH umbrella, it's not computational literary studies, it's another side of DH that's really more political, less computational, and more focused on the important work of organizing, framing, storing, reproducing, and managing knowledge in ways that involve the intersection between the daily life world in which we live and of course, all of the good old humanistic things that we love so much. The intersection of theory, praxis, and pedagogy. And pedagogy is a really important element of her work. One of the chapters of her book is specifically on teaching. She is the coordinator of the Graduate Certificate in Digital Studies at Salem State, the coordinator of the combined BA and Master's in Education, English Education, and the interim coordinator, I don't know if this is still true, of the MA in English, still true. Okay, so there you go. So I mean, that intersection between sort of teaching, thinking, learning, and doing the work of producing archives, thinking through archival structures, and creating workflow strategies that disrupt colonial and neo-colonial ways of thinking is at the heart of what Professor Risam does, and we're really glad to have her here today to give us this talk. So please join me in welcoming her.
All right, good. Thank you so much, Eric, for your introduction, and to all of you for coming today. I am going to share some of my newest work for a book tentatively titled Insurgent Academics, which is trying to construct an intellectual history of what I term academic insurgency, which is a mode of academic life that I propose has power to transform the humanities and the contemporary academy. And to give you a little context for this work, it emerges in a roundabout way from my first book, New Digital Worlds, Post-Colonial Digital Humanities and Theory, Praxis, Pedagogy, which addresses some of the questions that are at the core of my research agenda, and I've projected them up here. So who is and who isn't legible in our digital cultural inheritance? How do cultural objects and digitization intersect to create value and cultural power for some voices, but not for others? Whose stories are revealed to be the priority in our digital cultural record? And how do perceptions of what digital humanities is, or what my colleague Alico Ortega calls what digital humanities can be, shape our understanding of how humanities research practices can be transformed? And I come at this from the belief that digital humanities has indelibly shaped our digital cultural record. It has brought together practitioners from library roles, faculty roles, graduate students, as well as colleagues working in archives, libraries, and museums and galleries. But at the same time, the dominant practices of digital humanities are reproducing the exclusions and biases that we already know exist in print culture. And they're products of phenomena like racism, capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy. But even worse, these gaps and omissions are not simply being reproduced. They're actually being amplified by virtue of the fact that this scholarship and these projects are going online. And as publics are looking primarily to the internet as sources of information, I'm guided by this belief that those of us who choose to use digital humanities in the work that we do have a responsibility to ensure that what those publics find are not simply a reproduction of literary and cultural canons, but instead give voice to those that have long gone unheard. So in my first book, I argue that post-colonial digital humanities is a viable approach to uncovering and remediating these inequalities in the digital cultural record, recognizing, though, of course, that there is material that was never preserved, there are some voices that will never be recoverable. I tackle these issues in this book throughout the full supply chain of academic research, so from the research itself, to the archives that we use for our research, to how our professional organizations function, to how we teach. So I trace the formations of both digital humanities and post-colonial studies, kind of looking for ways they've had points of connection over time and identifying how together they can intervene in digital knowledge production. I examine the role of colonial violence in digital archives and the possibilities of post-colonial digital archives, particularly those with more digital materials, in intervening and resisting this violence. As I mentioned before, I focus on, as well as on professional organizations, in this case looking at the colonialist dimensions of the global professional organizations that facilitate digital humanities research. And then also looking at some of the initiatives that have tried to decenter these organizations. I also situate our work in pedagogical contexts, thinking about how we can engage our students in decentering the dominance of the global north and its stories in the digital cultural record. And then finally, I attend to how algorithms and natural language processing software, which are often used in digital humanities research, though not exclusively, produce universalist notions of the human that we really need to think about addressing. And we've seen applications, of these algorithmic biases and things like facial recognition and self-driving cars, for example, not recognizing people of color. So while I was recovering from writing that book, I was struck by two realizations. The first one is that the primary audience of that first book was actually digital humanists, but specifically white digital humanists, particularly people who were likely to be sold on the ideas that my friends and colleagues and I had been sharing with them in professional conversations for years, but they weren't going to believe it until someone handed them a monograph. And then the second realization was that I actually don't want to spend the rest of my career telling white people how to do digital humanities better. And the spaces that I want to build and the spaces that I want to build up are particularly the ones that focus and foster excitement and interest in digital humanities for early career scholars of color, particularly those working in areas that overlap with my backgrounds, which are in post-colonial and African diaspora studies. So that's really I think that really the way we get traction in this kind of work that needs to be done to remediate the digital cultural record is thinking about how to support these scholars. And Elizabeth Lash, who's a very noted scholar of feminist digital humanities, once said to me that the development of these areas of study in digital humanities lags precisely because many of us who do this work are in positions that are not at research universities. So I'm in a teaching intensive university with a 4-4 teaching load, which I don't really teach four classes a semester. I have all of those hats that I wear that Eric mentioned, those are ways to avoid teaching. Many of us are also in jobs in libraries and archives that are not in faculty positions. And so while we build up networks to connect with and support and mentor other people's students, which you can imagine earns us so much credit at our day jobs, there's still this very critical question of how do we support early career researchers, scholars of color, working in digital humanities. And particularly at this moment where it feels like the humanities and higher ed are imploding. Although the humanities kind of always feels like it's imploding. But higher ed, we can certainly point to college closings and mergers and lack of jobs as clear indicators as well. And we're also contending with this fact that even though digital humanities has kind of been around in common parlance for over a decade, that hiring committees and tenure and promotion committees still do not understand how to evaluate digital scholarship. And This raises a question not only for digital humanities, but interventions like public humanities, experimental humanities, and mobilized humanities, of why would scholars of color who already occupy vulnerable positions in the academy even want to pursue this work when it's under such vulnerable circumstances? But, and this is the question that's at the heart of my new book, what if these innovative humanities initiatives could be connected to an intellectual history of the work of scholars of color in the academy? If there are similarities we can trace over time, then maybe that could be a key to helping scholars of color build a better life for ourselves in the academy. So this is what I'm working on in the book. So academic insurgency, as I'm thinking about it, weaves together the past, present, and future of humanities knowledge production. It connects contemporary developments in mobilized, experimental, digital, and public humanities to a long trajectory of interventions that have been made by scholars of color within higher education. And I propose that this is a lineage that begins with professors' protest literature of the late 19th and early 20th century, and that we can trace it throughout the 20th century in the careers of post-colonial African diaspora and U.S. ethnic intellectuals like W.B. Du Bois, who I'll return to in a bit as an example of this, but also people like Audre Lorde, Sylvia Wynter, Bell Hooks, and so forth. We can also link contemporary academic insurgency to movements in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s to establish Black and ethnic studies departments, as well as the rise of post-colonial and third world feminisms in the 1980s and the 1990s. And what links these interventions are the transformative effects that the scholars engaged in them have had on higher education itself. And it has thus possibilities for transforming not only humanities knowledge production, particularly in the service of communities of color, but also changing the very nature of higher education itself. So to kind of talk through this and then talk about several examples, the first being an older one, which is the case of W.B. Du Bois, and then a more contemporary one, the Colored Convention Project, and if I have time, I got a third one. So the prototypical example of an insurgent academic is African-American intellectual W.B. Du Bois, who is known for his work fostering knowledge production on African-American life, as well as in his investment in decolonization. And in full disclosure, I wrote a dissertation on him, and then ignored him for 5 years. So now he's getting his due in my life again. So his career as an academic typifies academic insurgency through his interventions in African diaspora studies, which are marked by what I see as being the characteristics of academic insurgency: multidisciplinarity and multimodal, multi-genre approaches to scholarship that promotes social justice and equity across divisions between academic and general publics. So Du Bois's work shows the fluidity of discipline that's at the heart of academic insurgency. On his 25th birthday, he set forth a very ambitious plan in his journal where he wrote that he wanted to make a name in science, to make a name in literature, and thus to raise my race. So he recognized the importance of interdisciplinary approaches to social inequalities, particularly those based on race. And he speaks to the importance of blending the sciences and humanities to the cause of racial uplift. And we see this running over and over throughout his work in different ways. And this is a markedly different approach to academic knowledge production than that of hyper-specialization, with which so many of us have experienced, and that's endemic to scholarship. But his hybrid and flexible approach to disciplinarity comes out of his training, which will sound remarkably unlike the training that most of us have had. He had a liberal arts education from Fisk, but then during his graduate work at Harvard and at University of Berlin, he kind of wended back and forth between psychology, sociology, economics, political science, history, and philosophy. But this diverse training actually equipped him with an interdisciplinary background that had direct effects on the kind of scholarship that he was able to do. And so then he went on to take his first academic job at Wilberforce University, where he wrote that his goal was, and I quote, to build a great university through the study of African American life. And just a fun fact, his job at Wilberforce was in classics. I mean, can you imagine me just getting a job in classics? That says something about the nature of his background and training, which is very different than my own, and very different than the nature of undergraduate education that we get today. But he was always sort of moving into these positions that were interdisciplinary, and they influenced his work. But he wouldn't actually have this opportunity to build the great university until he went to Atlanta University, where he turned that university into a center for what he called the systematic and conscientious study of the American Negro. But for Du Bois, recognizing that the transformative possibilities of the university from academic insurgency weren't just in academic knowledge production being locked up in the academy. He recognized as well the importance of working with communities, and that custodianship over knowledge is not the sole domain of professors. So even before he left university life in 1910 to run the crisis, and he would return to the university later as well, he understood, and his experiments with knowledge production reflected the importance of communicating with and working with multiple audiences. So he ventured into the means of ownership over the production of knowledge, right down to the printing plant that he bought to co-found the Moon Illustrated Weekly in 1905. And his monthly, The Horizon, a journal of the color line, ran from 1907 to 1910 and shared original writing on African American life. And this investment in communicating with multiple publics is also reflected in his own experimentation with genres of writing. And that's a key part of academic insurgency as well. So in addition to writing for periodicals, he disseminated his thoughts on African American life in multiple genres. He wrote plays and fables and short stories and pageants and novels, very bad novels. Very bad novels that I wrote an entire dissertation on. Even his classic, The Souls of Black Folk from 1903, blends genres as varied as elegy, autobiography, sociological study, and mythology. And the crossing of genres is integral to his public intellectualism and his scholar activism as his ways of communicating these essential ideas about African American life and racial uplift from his scholarship, but to multiple audiences who may not pick up the Philadelphia Negro, for example. The cumulative effect of these dimensions of academic insurgency is the possibility of affecting social change through multiple avenues and outlets, rather than doing so from a particular disciplinary home, or even a particular institutional home, as the case was for Du Bois. And they further speak to the significance of the intersections of theory and praxis, particularly for communities that have been historically been objects rather than subjects of knowledge. So academic insurgency foregrounds an obligation to avoid reproducing the conditions of knowledge production in dominant formations of discipline, audience, and genre. So I'm going to briefly turn to examples. One is very concrete and the other is a prototype that exemplify the contemporary dimensions of academic insurgency. And we can trace these themes from Du Bois's work in this scholarship as well, specifically interdisciplinarity, facility with genre, and attention to multiple audiences. The first is the Colored Conventions project housed at the University of Delaware, which is a really wonderful digital humanities project. Anybody here worked on it? Oh, awesome. Douglas Day, or? Yeah, Douglas Day. Okay. I have some feelings about Douglas Day that I will share. The project won the 2016 Modern Language Association Prize for a digital project. It's comprised of a very diverse group of scholars, librarians, graduate students, undergraduate researchers, and community members. And as a side note here, even just in that composition, that diverse composition of their participants, we see this transformation of labor structures that are typical of digital humanities, but unusual for most humanities scholarship. And that transformation of labor is actually one of these necessary outcomes of academic insurgency. So when I say I'm talking about transforming the academy, labor is one area, one example where that is critical. The project was co-founded by P. Gabrielle Foreman, a professor of African American Studies and 19th century literature at the University of Delaware, as well, along with Jim Casey, who is now at Princeton as a postdoc. He was at the time a graduate student at the University of Delaware. And something I also want to note is that while Foreman and Casey are co-founders and directors, and again, this goes back to better labor in the academy, they facilitate a model of leadership that is as non-hierarchical as possible. So if you ask one of them to come speak as a project, about the project and events, they're as likely to get off the stage and to elevate their colleagues as they are to agree to come. And so that's what I mean in part when I say that academic insurgency holds this possibility for scholars of color, building a better life for ourselves and each other and the Academy. The committee chairs and project leaders involved in the Colored Conventions project span academic and non-academic roles at institutions and extra-institutionally around the country. Influenced by the interdisciplinary nature of its participants, the project includes expertise from areas as diverse as literary studies, history, nonprofits, organizing, education, film, sociology, library science, fine arts, and more. The project is committed to generating an online hub that, in their words, brings varied African American history to life and attends to social justice activism and scholarship and research by offering an opportunity for deep engagement with 19th century Black political organizing. And the interdisciplinary expertise, remember interdisciplinary is one of these key themes of academic insurgency, we can see in Du Bois, is reflected in this project, which actually focuses on the Colored Conventions movement, which is a series of national, regional, and state conventions held in the decades before and after the Civil War that brought together African American delegates who were, some of them were free, some of them were fugitives, and their ranks included writers and publishers and abolitionists and business people and clergy, coming together to build Black leadership to further causes like abolition, labor, healthcare, education, and so on. And then the while Colored Conventions, although maybe this is changing, I think because of this project, hasn't been as well known as, say, the NAACP, it's often seen as a precursor to such organizations. The interdisciplinary dimensions of the project are most clearly evident in the range of genres in which participants engage to tell the stories of the Colored Conventions movement. So in addition to prose writing that conveys the history of the Colored Conventions, the project includes digital exhibits which contextualize and tell the story in multimodal ways through recovered and digitized materials. They have network analyses of relationships between delegates that allow users to explore. They have a corpus of material that facilitates text mining of the materials. And this use of multiple genres is akin to that facility of genre that earlier insurgent academics like Du Bois demonstrate in their own work, along with, of course, the blending of humanities and sciences towards the cause of racial uplift. And this approach to genre is also key to engaging with multiple publics, which is also a key part of this academic insurgency. So these genres communicate in multiple registers and multiple modes for audiences as varied as those who are interested in the project because they are doing research, or those who are just interested because they just want to know about it. So through crowdsourcing initiatives like Douglas Day, which it seems like some of you have been part of, on February 14th, they hold distributed and networked events like transcribe-a-thons for the Colored Conventions-related material, and in doing so are constantly thinking about ways to bring new communities of interlocutors into the project. And I would say, I said I was going to have some words, which is I'm a little ambivalent about crowdsourcing, because it always feels a little bit like do free labor on our project for us. But this year's Douglas Day was actually a readathon. So I thought that changed the equation a little bit, for me at least. They've also worked with partners at African Methodist Episcopal churches, which ties in with the history of the Colored Conventions themselves. The first documented one was at an AME church in Philadelphia in 1830. So they're actively working in spaces between academic, academy and community, but really troubling that false binary between ivory tower and real world, and facilitating community engagement and knowledge production, much in a similar mode as people who came before, like Du Bois. So that's an example of academic insurgency in action, but I'm also concerned with this bigger question of what kind of infrastructure do we need to sustain and support this kind of work? And this is a question that Alex Hill and I have been exploring through the idea of a super commons. Although I'm supposed to asterisk that and say the name might change. So within the humanities knowledge infrastructures, we have this idea of the commons. We've seen initiatives like DH Commons, which has tried to be, and is now defunct, but tried to be a hub for coordinating digital humanities research. We've Many of you are probably familiar with Humanities Commons, which is the MLA's platform for scholarly communication. This idea of the commons tends to rely on the investment of significant amounts of funds and labor and bandwidth. And as a result, these platforms aren't very nimble and they aren't necessarily suited to supporting flexible, responsive, and nimble scholarship, particularly projects like Torn Apart Separados, which is a series of data visualizations that a team of us created in 1 week to respond to the family separation immigration policy last June. And I'm happy to say more about that project during the Q&A if you want me to show it to you. But because of these interventions, because our interventions immobilized humanities, particularly humanities projects undertaken by small teams of researchers across institutions, kind of just in time as issues arise that we want to pool our skills to respond to, there also aren't a lot of rewards for that work, particularly not within traditional reward structures of the Academy. So we've been thinking through whether we can conceptualize this idea of a super commons, which unlike a commons is not a single platform, but is instead a network of platforms born out of these intra-institutional collectives of scholars that are collaborating with communities outside of the Academy. And the prototype for this is the Nimble Tense Toolkit, which is a collection of case studies of how to channel scholarly activity at moments of crisis, like environmental, political, social, cultural crisis. And Torn Apart is one of these projects. Rapid response research is what we extrapolated from Torn Apart, a model for doing quick digital projects. And these projects are proofs of concept for robust, low-cost, and low-maintenance digital scholarship that is produced outside of the typical labor and reward structures of the Academy. So the idea of a super commons is to try and impart value back into this work, and the idea is grounded in the undercommons proposed by Fred Moten and Stefano Harney, which makes the case for fugitive practices of academic labor drawn from Maroonage and Black radical traditions. And the supercommons draws on Moten and Harney's proposition that the only relationship to the university is a criminal one that's based on the repurposing of university resources for collaborative knowledge production with our communities. But unlike the undercommons, which takes resources kind of unidirectionally from the Academy into the community, we're thinking about the supercommons as multi-directional flow between both. And the reason we want to sort of keep pushing on how we can conceptualize these kinds of initiatives as part of supercommons is to try and impart value to an infrastructure that facilitates this kind of mobilized humanities scholarship. And in sort of thinking about how we can, again, further support the rise of coordinated extra-institutional collaborations that work function outside of grant funding and outside of these sort of standard reward mechanisms. And in doing so, put pressure on people who are administrators, who are senior scholars, who are evaluating scholarship to understand that these kinds of digital projects that we undertake are in fact valuable to knowledge production and to society as well. So just to end, I want to reiterate that this vision of academic insurgency that I propose is one that shows that we can find for digital, public, experimental, mobilized other forms of innovative humanities research has a long trajectory. It has a history that's connected to a lot of really important moments where scholars of color have demanded a change in business as usual in higher education, with varying degrees of success, but certainly, at least for those of us who work in those areas, as sort of really key examples we can look to for the basis and inspiration for our own work. And academic insurgency itself really has at its core a focus on interdisciplinarity, engagement with multiple genres and modes of communication, and works in the service of multiple audiences. And so in this book, I'm hoping that by looking towards our intellectual past, we can find ways of supporting and sustaining digital knowledge production, both today and in the future. Thank you.
Can you handle questions? Or?
Yes, of course.
I want to fasten kind of on the part of your talk where, it's kind of this kind of thing that you came back to over and over, which is that, this kind of work has not been valued institutionally.
Yeah.
To what extent is that a function of the insurgency or of the scholars that we're talking about, and to what extent is it a function of the consolidation of the institutional university? Because the difference between us and Du Bois, right, is that Du Bois is operating in a completely different institutional context. To some, I guess I'm wondering about to what extent the story you're telling about the kind of narrowing of the kinds of work that academics are supposed to do that is valued and rewarded in academia is a story about institutionalization, not a story about kind of anti-insurgency in some sense, right? Or what the connection is between those two and how they're caught up together.
Yeah, I'm not saying it is a narrative of anti-insurgency. I actually think, a great many of academics picture themselves as insurgents in their own way. I think that what's interesting here is that, it seems, looking at Du Bois's career, like there was this freedom, right, of movement, this ability to move across genres, to move across disciplines, to move across roles in and out of the academy. But I think it's really key to remember that this, all the while he is living and working in Jim Crow America. And so as easy or as sort of fluid and flexible and open as I may have made this sound, a lot of his choices were really made sort of in relation to a broader landscape of what it meant to be an African-American intellectual at that time, and also the pressures he was facing, particularly as his politics grew more leftist, and he was kind of dogged by charges of that he was a socialist, which he was, and that he would, and his relationship with the NAACP, which was kind of always rapidly deteriorating at a certain point. So I think on the one hand, it's important not to, that I may have conveyed his narrative as a romanticized one, but it was actually a very fraught one that didn't really come out here, but it is coming out in my book. But at the same time, I think that there is I think that the larger picture is actually one that is economic, and that's around the academic job market and how people are sort of coerced into particular decisions around what they're researching and what they're writing about, what their dissertations are about in this bid to be marketable. And I think for me, this notion of insurgency is actually a kind of way of thinking through, could we find a way of valuing this work both within higher education, but also valuing it in a broader sense and in a societal sense to kind of radically refuse the restrictions of the job market. That's not going to transform the academic job market, and there are very real issues there. But you can also hear in what I said, I'm talking about collaborations with libraries, collaborations with archives, galleries, museums, communities. I'm very much invested in this idea that the Academy is really trying to position itself as the locus of knowledge production and of expertise, when there is so much expertise that exists beyond the walls of our campuses. And can we actually think about ways of leveraging those connections and making those connections and leveraging them and facilitating those collaborations to try and actually sort of change this broader idea of the Academy as this place of knowledge by itself. So that was not exactly an answer to your question, but that's I think that the insurgency is actually a response to the narrowing that comes out of this particular economic pressure. Yeah.
I got a question, mostly kind of about questions of speed and time.
Yeah.
And your characterization of Du Bois's novels as being really, really bad, but also had the need to sort of work across multiple genres and multiple media. And I'm thinking here about, sort of at different ends of the spectrum. You've got something like a long-form monograph that takes multiple years to research and write, and is only going to, there's sort of people who are only going to be convinced if you could put that into their hands, versus something like a rapid response model. And so thinking about, right, assuming that not everyone can produce in every genre at all times for all purposes, right? Where are those sweet spots that you see developing from your work in collaboration?
I am very glad you asked. So, this is one of the other 4 talks. This is actually, you got a whole brand new unique talk, which is why it's like less like polished than like every other talk I'm doing this semester. But one of the other ones is actually on like academic time. So how many of you have read or heard of The Slow Professor? Okay, so I read The Slow Professor in an hour, which completely obviously means I missed the point. But the idea behind this book, which is a really fascinating one, is that there have been slow movements for food and slow movements for other things. There hasn't been a movement for slow academia. And they frame this as kind of a phenomenon of a neoliberal university, where there's this publish and perish mentality. You've got to do everything. You've got to do everything really quickly. And they say it's incumbent on tenured faculty members to actually resist this, to slow down, to set a model where we could imagine a new way of academic living. And in theory, I buy this. There have been some really interesting critiques, largely around the fact that if you were to actually have tenured faculty members embracing the slow professing, the burden of the work will likely then fall onto junior faculty and then worse, onto contingent faculty. And so, there isn't going to be some kind of slowdown that isn't actually going to amp up the labor burden on somebody else. And they actually had a follow-up where they were like, actually, we didn't really mean literally slowing down. Then I'm not sure what they meant, but okay. Well, they meant it's about reshaping our relationship to time in the academy. One critique that I did not see, that I guess I will probably end up making in this book that I'm writing, is that there are some of us who embody particular identities in the academy, women of color, for example, who, if we were to slow down, are already contending with particular perceptions of our intelligence, of our belonging in the academy, and that slowing down may actually not be a privilege that we necessarily have. And this affects it's not only race and gender, multiple axes of identity. And so I've had this on my mind, particularly because I was working on a digital humanities project that we did in 7 days. And that I don't think I would wish on anybody, because when you try to do a project in 7 days, it's pretty much out of control and it's all the time. But, so I want to I'll just pull up the project. But what I wanted to say about that is that I think there is the possibility that there are times where we want to reshape our relationship to the academy, and that we want to recognize that we can embody different relationships between time and different moments, but that also not everyone has to do everything. As I was saying, doing a project that's a series of data visualizations in a week is frankly, it's not really misguided, it was fun, but it was also it took a huge toll on our jobs and on our lives and on our families and cats and things like that. And so this was the project, and basically what we did was sort of ask ourselves, at these moments where we feel like there is literally nothing we can do, is there anything we can do? And our answer was to spend 3 days looking for all the research we could on immigrant detention. We ended up settling on trying to figure out where the immigrant detention centers were in the United States, as well as where were the shelters where children were being held when they were separated from families by the U.S. government, which is represented on our first data visualization here, which may be hard to see, but the large orange dots refer to immigrant detention centers that are currently in use. as of the date of our data set, which came from a FOIA document that had been FOIA'd in November 2017. The smaller orange dots refer to ICE facilities that are contracted for use for immigrant detention, but have not did not have a daily population at that time of the data. And then it's harder to see, but these lavender dots are the detention centers where children were held. And so we basically, there was no list. So that data we can compile and verify and stuff like that. And then after 3 days, then we spent a day on Skype drawing pictures and holding them up to our cameras and trying to prototype data visualizations, and then a couple of days implementing them, and then bam, we were done. Now, this felt great in a way because it felt like a moment where we were channeling our skills at research in digital humanities and doing something that also had a lot of significant meaning for all of us. As people, I mean, all of us working on the project are either immigrants or grew up in the borderlands of the US-Mexico border, and so we all had a personal stake in it. And that was sort of the moment where we decided to do it. We would just drop our lives and make this work. And the goal really, and we succeeded at this, was to figure out how to court the media cycle to get this project out there in the media, which we did because we wanted to get the word out that we had the locations of the children's shelters so we could share them with activists and social workers and lawyers, which we were able to do. So we all felt, good about that. Of course, I read yesterday, US government wants 2 more years to reunite children and parents because they never tracked where they sent them. But, so there's that. Now, conversely, while we were doing that project, we came up with several questions about kind of what was actually the financial landscape subtending this carceral landscape of immigrant detention that spread throughout the United States that we saw. And so that was how we ended up doing a project that we lovingly titled Follow the Money, secretly between us, between the group working on it. And what we did was we ended up scraping 20,000 government documents, 20,000 government contracts that ICE gave out to different people, individuals, companies, nonprofits, and so forth to fund all the different stuff you need to detain immigrants, right? Everything from socks to laptops to guns, right? And so we wanted to do that. Now this project did not take a week. This project took 2 months. And so, I mean, that was a moment where we realized we lost the media cycle, so there was no rush. I mean, there was a rush in that we wanted to get it out and get it done, while people still were paying attention to our project, but the media cycle was gone, so we knew we had more time. We were working with a lot more data. We relied, for the first volume, on one person to code, and then that was not feasible for the second volume, so there were actually 4 of us coding with varying levels of skills, mine being the worst. But we were all working on it, and so when you had suddenly a team rather than one person, suddenly that meant there had to be more conversations about how we were going to do this and how to try and work in ways that were similar, make sure we were keeping our the visualizations each of us were working on interoperable and so forth. So that took 2 months. And that was okay, because we were understanding sort of what we were doing, why we were doing it, and how the scope related to our goals. So when I'm writing a monograph, which I did once, I often wonder how much time I actually spent writing the monograph versus how much time I spent freaking out about writing the monograph. But, all told, it was a multi-year experience because that was the judgment call kind of made around people aren't going to believe this stuff unless there's a book on it. And it's actually very funny. One of my colleagues, Ellie Ortega at Northeastern, who she actually remarked to me, we had a book launch. She came and she spoke, and she said that the best thing about this book is that now people can't say we never said it because it's a book, right? But at the same time, it makes her really angry that it had to be a book for people to actually believe that these ideas about how we do digital humanities needs to change is actually a true idea, right? Because there have been articles, there have been conference presentations, there have been other genres, but it was the book that really made people be like, oh yes! as if we had never said any of these things ever before. But it's like the calculation was that investment needs to be made because I want to move the field in this particular way. Whether or not it does or doesn't. It did sell out 3 print runs, so that makes me happy, and maybe it will. But I think that's the question, right? Is like measuring when are these moments where we are going to decide to work at a particular speed for a particular goal, and does that make sense? And is that commensurate? So it didn't make any sense to do that in a week. We could have, I'm sure, if we literally didn't sleep at all, but there was actually no need to at that point. And so I think it's all around design by necessity and choices made particularly around the goals, the temporal goals, the broader audience goals, and so forth.
Thank you for your presentation. So I have a few different thoughts. One is we brought V Bravo here last week, who's working on the franchise, which is this documentary series on the money behind prison. So he's following all of the money, and it would be good, I think, for you to hook up with him on the ICE stuff in New York in particular, which is where so far he's trying to shop to on HBO, etc.
Okay.
Just might be a useful thing. Secondly, small question. So the volume 1 of this project doesn't show also like the infants who are put in like foster care, right? Like it doesn't have those folks. Okay.
No. So I mean,
that's another.
Yes. I mean, if you want to know more than I know now more than I ever want to know about government contracting and what the government does with children. So the infrastructure that is those purple dots are, were actually as a kind of a developed over time to manage children who legitimately arrived unaccompanied at the US border. And so there's this whole scheme, and sort of fun backstory. Prior to when we actually did Torn Apart, there was this question actually between Alex Hill and I about should we do a project in response to the lost children? If you remember late May, the children got lost. And that was actually very instructive because we learned everything we could about the Office of Refugee Resettlement that manages unaccompanied minors. And also realized very quickly that those allegedly lost children do not want to be found. And that was when we also started building up our relationships with activists and social workers. But what they do is, so the children come, if they're actually unaccompanied, they're picked up by Customs and Border Patrol, they're handed off to ICE's custody. ICE then gives them to the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is a division of the Department of Health and Human Services. ORR can keep the children for up to 20 days under the Flores settlement in 1996, which the Trump administration is currently trying to undermine. And then within 20 days, they have to either find a sponsor or relative, and as of the data that we had in 2017, 90% of kids go to relatives. Just 10% go to sponsors, and based on our connections with activists that we had made and with social workers, there are actually sponsors who go and get the children and connect them with family members who are undocumented who don't want to come and claim their children. So this is, that's what happened with unaccompanied minors. So when children started being separated from their families, they were actually slotted into this same infrastructure that already existed to handle unaccompanied minors, and that's how that happened. The foster care system, which is actually part of the reason that the government's saying the kids will not be found for 2 years, because their children, once they're released out of the custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, they call within 30 days. If no one picks up the phone or if they can't get an answer, the children are lost, and they disavow any responsibility for these children because they're not in their custody anymore. So that's kind of that.
And then a kind of comment. So I'm reading Saidiya Hartman's new book, which I would recommend if you haven't done it yet. And what I was thinking as you were talking is, I think Du Bois is the wrong figure for this. I actually don't think he helps you do as much as other figures do, like Ida B. Wells or Andrew Lee Cooper, for a few reasons. I mean, one is that, you know, you could at least argue that Ida B. Wells, for example, as a journalist, is able to kind of have a certain kind of public engagement and kind of do multimodal sort of stuff in a way that Du Bois is not exactly able to, at least earlier Du Bois.
Yeah.
So that's sort of one issue. But then also just thinking about one of the things that seems central to the early, like Philadelphia Negro Boys, right, is this idea that there are going to be a few people who are going to kind of contest knowledge about Black life, and they're going to do it through, you know, the inside of, you know, doing sociology in a different kind of way, et cetera, et cetera. But part of what comes with that, of course, is that the lens through which they're looking at these fugitive, you know, kinds of lives is absolutely, you know, sexist and white supremacist, right?
Yeah.
And so, I don't know, I just think that it might be useful to kind of, you know, I mean, Du Bois is everywhere all the time, and I understand you wrote a dissertation about him, so it makes sense in that way, but it might be useful just to think about some other people who get you further in terms of thinking about insurgency.
So, if, I don't know if you're on Twitter, but if you're on Twitter and you want to see some of the other people that I'm writing about, I'm not like, so hashtag Insurgent Academics is where I like periodically post notes about what I'm reading or working on. And so in February for 28 days, I actually tweeted 28 people who are going to be in this book. So even though the emphasis here was on Du Bois, mostly because I do have a 3-3 teaching, and so that's where I started, because it's like, that's in my head, and he, for me, was this figure that sort of did these things. There are actually tons more people who I'm actually writing about. I mean, Angela Davis, for example, is one person. Anna Julia Cooper is another one. Mary McLeod Bethune. I mean, there's a very long list of people. But I appreciate your point, and I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I feel like Du Bois is like such a Victorian,
Yeah, absolutely.
you know, and that really has a strong influence. And there's also this kind of disjuncture, or it's probably not really, because when you read his really bad last novels, I think you see that those Victorian values actually never really went away so much, even though he's like become a leftist. There is still that Victorian kind of value structure. Yeah,
how do you square the circle about labor and expertise here? Right, there's a real tension between the things you're presenting about, oh, you know, it's so great that we can kind of think through the insurgent mode of doing these things randomly and wildly and for the sake of it. But also in order to do that, you need an enormous amount of expertise and time and training to do some of these things. And you know, I really take your point about senior colleagues are more able to slow down than junior colleagues, for sure. And in order to do a lot of the things that the senior colleagues necessarily want, in our current structure involves a lot of tiered hierarchies of who is doing what in what ways. And you know, in some ways the Colleague Prevention Project does represent that in really productive ways too. But I would like to hear you think a little bit more about what that looks like in terms of labor expertise and even the time that's necessary to kind of delegate accordingly in the first place.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really key question. And you know, so if you are interested in undertaking research at ridiculous amounts of speed, we wrote a whole thing on how to do it, if you want to punish yourself. But, so one thing that we sort of frequently remark on is the reason we were able to do that project in 7 days is because half of us spent a decade doing this work. We were intentionally putting together a team that had a variety of expertise, intentionally also a team where everyone was trained in post-colonial theory and border theory. And that we were able to do that because we are really well networked. And so we were really in the precise position of privilege to be able to do that, and also like had enough street cred to convince people that they wanted to like join on this like, cockamamie plan, right? So there is that. But then I see, for example, the work of scholars like Sylvia Fernandez and Myra Alvarez are at the University of Houston. As graduate students, they started a project called Borderlands Archives Cartography, where they felt like they had all this expertise on newspapers of the borderlands that they were coming across in their dissertation research, and then they wanted to do some mapping and some digital projects with what they found because they felt like they wanted to disseminate it, and they they're using mostly the same kind of out-of-the-box tools that color conventions use. Color conventions like Omeka and Gephi, and it's not, they didn't, code something from the ground up at all in any way. So this was it. So Sylvia and Myra, so they wanted to put this project. They figured out how to do it. They learned the skills. Now they're working on a new project, or Sylvia is leading a new project. called United Fronteras, and they're now learning how to work in, she is learning how to code for that project, because she built her confidence on her first project and working on Torn Apart, and now she feels like she can dive in. And so I mean, it's really for me about ensuring that there is that capacity building at the junior scholar level. For me, for my colleagues, we weren't trained in this. And we just wanted to do things. And so we learned how to do them because we wanted to answer questions, and we thought maybe these methods that were different than what we were trained might help us answer questions in ways that were better. And it's about cultivating that mindset. And that's actually very connected to the mindset I cultivate in my own students. I don't have doctoral students, I have master's students, and they're actually doing a really awesome project on Elder Speaker right now. But it is not about teaching them how to do it. It's not teaching them how to use a platform. It's teaching them how to learn to use a platform and building their confidence that they can. And I think that's the key. I think that the weird thing is, like, in this area of study, in this digital humanities overlap with post-colonial Caribbean, African American, African diaspora studies, there actually aren't senior scholars. My generation or whatever, my cohort, we're about as senior as you get. And it's actually really funny. So I got called to consult on a Tier 3 Canada research chair hire, which is a full-level professor hire. And they called me, and they called Alex Hill, they called some other people, and they said, tell us who we should hire. And we're like, you should hire us. And they're like, we can't hire you. You're like assistant professor level. We're hiring for a full professor. And did they hire anyone? Of course not, because they really wanted to hire in that. And there were no senior people to hire, right? And so, I mean, because even there are people who are, I guess, in academic time, senior, but who are relatively new to digital humanities. And so they were not sort of fitting this sort of preconceived notion of what a senior scholar of digital humanities is, even though they are in their own right well-established, well-respected, well published, and all that. So there is that. I think that's why I'm interested in this connection, this kind of notion of insurgency, and what you're saying in this connection between labor and expertise. Because I think in part, one of the things that comes out of digital humanities that I value is that expertise really is distributed, and that you can have expertise in a particular area and contribute it to a project and understand what someone else is doing. And I think you need to understand what the code, if you're not the coder, you need to know what the coder's doing. You need to understand what they're doing. They need to understand the expertise you bring too, and vice versa on a whole team. But then also there is kind of that building up of confidence of junior scholars.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
I saw you kind of move early, but you want to.
I think you got covered by everybody.
All right. Well, then please join me in thanking.
Thank you.